Welcome to the Emotional Balance Sheet, the go-to podcast for parents with multiple kids, especially those with twins, triplets, or more, who are navigating the maze of modern family life and personal finance. Whether you're overwhelmed by education or retirement planning, parenting dilemmas, career transitions, or trying to define your purpose and plan, we're here to guide you with empathy, encouragement, and expertise. Hosted by Paul Fenner, founder of Tama Capital, a certified financial planner and parent to 4 kids, including a set of triplets. Our podcast is your ally in the quest for financial peace of mind, proving that money matters, but family comes first. Subscribe now and join our community of empowered parents at tamacapital.com. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for investment decisions. Clients of Tama may retain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
What does comprehensive financial planning even mean? At Tama Capital, it means a family office where lifestyle planning such as retirement, college, portfolio management, and tax prep and planning are all under one umbrella. But it goes beyond numbers. We focus as much on the emotional side of financial planning as we do on the financial side. We get you. We understand your challenges of building a family, business or career, and a healthy life. We are devoted to wealth planning for families like yours because we are you. Learn how our family can help your family by visiting tamacapital.com. Have you ever taken the time to think about who you are? We all have multiple identities, but how do these different people represent who we are and how do they come together? Christina Gossayn, a behavioral scientist and Ph.D. candidate in organizational behavior, has focused her research on how identities evolve over time, especially under the mantle of responsibilities that come with age. Our self-reflection can take a back seat as we juggle various roles from professionals to parenting, as we've often talked about on this podcast. For many, particularly working parents, the struggle to make time for reflection is real. Christina and I discuss practical ways for individuals, especially parents, to prioritize and define their purpose amidst the hustle of daily life. So as we prepare to embark on this journey into our own self, I invite you all to take a step back, reflect, and maybe discover something new about the ever-changing landscape of your own identity. Please enjoy my conversation with Christina Gossayn. So Christina, welcome to the Emotional Balance Sheet podcast. Let's just be honest with each other. I know that you have a little bit of nerves going on because you've never been on a podcast before, but that doesn't mean that you are not on your way to being an expert in your field of behavioral change and science. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Paul. Much appreciated. I'm super excited to be here, even though the little butterflies are fluttering around everywhere. But yes, I guess there's a first time for everything. And yeah, let's have some fun.
Like we were talking beforehand, one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation with you is that there's a lot of moms that listen to this show. I get a lot of feedback from my moms. And most people know that I'm a financial advisor and I primarily work with families who have either twins or triplets or 3 or more kids, and everybody's busy. I don't think there's anybody that's not busy these days. And one of the things that I found interesting about your work and just looking over your LinkedIn profile was this question of why do people not just take the time to think about their identity and their roles? And I think it's something that my wife, Teresa, and I struggle with. I know a lot of families I work with struggle with. And I'm always trying to figure out, and that's why I love having conversations with experts like you that can kind of lead some or shine some light on the whys. So why don't we kind of start there? Is in your research and your doctoral thesis, which we'll get into, start if you could give us an idea of like, why do people not give themselves, like I call it, the gift of time to really think about their identity or what they want to do?
I think that's such a great question. And I think the first thing that pops into my mind is that, when we're much younger, we have this abundance of, or at least what seems like an abundance of time, but we kind of don't really take note of what is happening inside. We don't really have that cognitive aptitude of looking towards your identity. We're not that reflexive yet when we're younger. And as we get older, as our responsibilities increase and we start chasing goals and, these expectations of where you have to be in life come at you, and responsibilities, families, all these different things start coming your way. And now your time is more filled up, and then you have less, the more aptitude you have for being reflexive in terms of thinking about who you are, why you're interested in this, as the seasons of your life change as well. I mean, from year to year, we're all adapting. Identity is not something that is fixed. It's a constant reevaluation. It's repairing, maintaining, forming, all these different evaluations of yourself. So in essence, it's a very reflexive process. So as you get older, you become more reflexive by nature. You start evaluating life more, but then you have less time to do this. I mean, unless you consciously make the choice to sit down every day and journal for 15 or 20 minutes, think about things. We're all kind of rushing from one thing, kids, meetings, rush back from work to go fetch the kids from school. Then a kid is sick and calls you. So your life is at a constant rush, and you're always having new goals. I mean, we hit one goal and we don't even celebrate. We're ready to hit the next one. So a lot of the time we get lost as individuals in the cycle of what we are trying to do, which is kind of sad because you're actually the focal point of your life, but you're always focusing on your husband or your children and their happiness, and you kind of come last. So my long story is basically that, I think as you get older, you have the ability to be more reflexive and reflect on your identity, but we, in essence, don't make it part of our lives because everything else seems more important. So I think it's really important to be reflexive about who you are, your values, your choices, to look at all your different identities. We have so many. We have our personal identity, which often comes last. Like we see this, or I saw it at least, and different studies as well with working mothers in particular. You're balancing all these identities, your work identity, your social identity, your personal identity. And I mean, your social identity comprises of so many other various identities, but the personal identity came last. With all the women that I interviewed, it's kind of the thing that gets dropped off. So when you have to drop a ball, it's generally one that affects you. So, if you won't make time for yourself, you won't go to the gym, or you'll cut out things, your social life, before you would cut out, maybe doing something for your child or for your husband or for your work. So yeah, I think identity is something you have to prioritize. The same way we look after our bodies and we try and eat well, go to the gym, being with yourself, reflecting on yourself, who you are, your different roles, what your identity looks like in those different roles is super important. So I think it's one of those things that has to actually come into the kind of the well-being sphere of life, which, I guess we look at when we look at things like mindfulness and mental health, but nowhere is there like an identity health. But it is a huge part of who we are. It is who we are. So, and I think a lot of the time we feel this dissonance, especially for moms, like you're trapped between so many different worlds and so many different identities. And a lot of the time they conflict, and you have these identity crises or tensions that you have to constantly manage. And it's not easy. And it's all going on in your head. So there's no one to really help you except yourself. So yeah,
I would agree. There's a lot going on inside your head there. That's a really interesting point that you make, is that as we get older, we actually become more reflective, but then at the same time, we'll tell ourselves we don't have the time to stop and think about it. But it really comes down to a matter of prioritization. Really, is in my world, I think about opportunity cost a lot. Everybody wants to go on the nice vacation and, put their kids through all the, extracurricular activities and, save for retirement and save for college. But there's very few families that can do everything. And I often have this phrase that I've said on the show, and I tell Teresa all the time, she probably gets sick of it, is that you can do most things in life, but you can't do everything. And so one of the, I think, roles that I see myself as an advisor, and especially trying to focus on behavioral change, is trying to help people align or first define what their purpose and objectives are, and then align them to the financial plan that we create, and making sure that they work well together. But to come back to this, is in your research and in your studying this topic, have you found anything that helps people make that time? Like, so they are doing the reflectiveness, I guess, inside their own mind, but how do they best take the time or make the time to do that, to slow down and really think about what it is that they want in their identity? Because I struggle with this personally, but I see the families I work with struggle with this, and just helping them define what their purpose is.
So I think that's a great question. And just before I answer that, something you said just triggered off something one of the ladies had said in one of my interviews, or the woman, sorry. And she said that, there's this analogy of, in your life, you're juggling all these balls. Some of them are glass balls and some of them are rubber balls. And she said, your whole life, you'll be juggling these balls. And she says, you have to be really careful about which balls you decide to drop, because you're going to have to drop some of them. But make sure you drop the rubber ones, because they'll bounce back up and you'll get them back into the juggle at some point. But when you drop the glass ones, that shatters. Then again, we could look at something like kintsugi from Japanese psychology, which says that kind of it embraces the broken parts and actually puts them back together with gold to signify that those cracks are actually beautiful and make you who you are and make you even more valuable. So I guess that's an additional spin on it. But I really do like the notion of thinking about all these things that you're juggling as rubber versus glass, and make sure you drop the rubber ones. And maybe this kind of leads into your question in the sense of, when you're thinking of prioritizing that time, do you think of yourself as a rubber glass or as a glass? And I think if you think of yourself as rubber, you're wrong. There's few things I would say so certainly, but I think that a lot of the time, especially as parents, we prioritize children over ourselves. We prioritize, things like work, because obviously you need to go to work. You need to provide for your family. It's a very important part of your life. But prioritizing yourself is so important, because if you have not filled your own cup, you cannot fill the cup of another. So I think that it really, like I said earlier, it really forms part of like your basic human health, the same way you would go to the gym, the same way you would, eat well, or try and eat well, and invest in going to the doctor when you're feeling sick. You need to look into yourself. And I think it's a commitment that you have to decide to make it exciting. And I think approach it as this kind of journey into discovering me, who I am. And it's amazing, when we look back on, the past year of your life, or the past 2 or 3 years, like how much you change and like the progression you've made. And I think the more you work on yourself, and I've found that a lot. I think I've worked on myself quite a bit in the last 2 or 3 years since COVID started, because we kind of had this period of silence where you were cut off from so much that I kind of jumped inside myself. And I think when you get to know yourself, you become a better leader, you become a better employee, you become a better husband or wife or mother, because you're able to control your own emotions better, your impulses better, because you understand what triggers you, what sets you off. You understand what drives you. You understand who you are. It comes down to answering basic questions like, what is my nationality? What is my gender? What is my race? Why are these things what they are? And write that down, your religious affiliation, anything, what drives you, what values you have, what morals you have. And, a lot of the time we store this information in our heads, and it's the same as journaling. Journaling works because you're physically writing, and there's a connection between your brain and your hand when you write something that almost releases this thought or feeling. And that's why journaling is so good for you. And I think that, you just have to prioritize this to be a better human. This is part of your development, and it's investing in yourself, essentially, the same way you would invest in going for a massage or to the physio if your back is sore, whatever it may be. So it's a conscious choice you have to make. And the older you get, you have to make difficult choices, even when you don't want to do it, like getting up early to go to the gym. And this is not, you don't have to spend 2 hours on yourself. It's, 10 minutes every day. If a thought pops in your head, like jot it, make a note on your phone and jot it in there to add to your, this kind of evolution of what your identity is, the various identities you have. And again, as I said, it changes. So, you might go through a divorce, or your child might pass away, and suddenly there's this huge happening. And that's something that you include there, and you see how your identity has shifted from that experience. And, it's a really good way of evaluating yourself and keeping yourself on track.
Working with the women in your study, because it sounds like one of the things that I often talk about and I research quite a bit. I'm a big James Clear fan, Power of Habits, or Atomic Habits. When you were interviewing the women in your research study, were there any golden nuggets that you like kind of or themes that you saw consistently among the women that did this really well, that prioritized this time for themselves, or they were able to somehow make a habit out of something to then trigger, okay, this is how I'm going to spend the time thinking about this, writing it down, journaling, or a place, or any specifics that you came across that you found really intriguing?
So I think the one thing that did come up from a lot of the ladies is that they started identifying triggers. So the more they had gotten to know themselves, and a lot of the time getting to know themselves came from experiences that they'd had. And a lot of the times it wasn't positive experiences. It had come through. So my research is on, specifically my Ph.D. is on unconscious gender bias. So it would have been something that had triggered off that gender identity, and it then sends them down this like spiral of reflexivity and thought, and about how they're going to respond to that. And for a lot of the ladies, this was kind of the triggering moment into, I need to understand myself. I need to understand my leader identity. What makes me a good leader? There's a lot of every single one of them mentioned imposter syndrome. And these were all senior executive leaders. And it was sad for me in the sense, because they are incredible. They are not just as human beings, but as leaders, and in their work. They had done so much. They had inspired and influenced so many people. Their leadership wasn't just about the management piece, about making sure that the numbers are up and all those different kind of checklist items are done. It was about influencing people, moving people, other people in my team, kind of developing. Are they on the right track? And I think an interesting thing about motherhood is that it actually improves your negotiation, your communication skills, and to some degree your EQ as well, and your ability to think about other people. And so a lot of women that come back after being mothers, or women that have been mothers, kind of have that heightened skill set. So a lot of the time, like, I found that women weren't necessarily worried about climbing the ladder. That was kind of a bonus of what was happening, but they were really passionate about making sure that the people in their team were well looked after, are developing, are learning, are performing to their best ability. And I think that was amazing. And that goes back to the work you do on yourself, being sure and confident in who you are. Because if you're sure and confident in who you are, you're going to be a really good leader. And there's going to be this spillover effect. And you're going to start encouraging people to also do the self-discovery. So coming back to identity, I think it's just all these hardships almost, or not hardships, but these hurdles that women cross over that force them to think deeper. And some of the time it's not necessarily journaling, but it's just these incidents that really trigger them to think deeper and trigger them to think about themselves and who they are. Because if authenticity was something that came up a lot, is that if you don't know who you are and if you're not acting from a place of authenticity, people are going to notice it. People aren't going to really respond well to you. People, especially as a leader at that level, it just doesn't work. And for you as well, as a person, you don't want to be leaving half of yourself at the door when you come in and putting on this facade of who you are. You want to bring your whole self to work. And you want to bring your kind of unique footprint to that. And you can only do that if you know who you are. So it's, whether it's partly writing down, whether it's partly experiential, whether it's partly kind of these dialogues that you have either with your colleagues or with HR or whoever's in the room about that trigger off who you are, as long as in some way you are being forced to think about this, you really do make time to go and sit down with yourself when you have a moment. Or, I mean, when you're to be reflexive in my own head. And then, you come home and you write down what you need to. So you find your place of meditation almost. And yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to be writing it down, but at some point you need to kind of jot it down. But even if it is happening in your head, but consistently is the key thing to see your progression.
That's an interesting point that you made about in your study finding that being a mom, and I think I can even relate to this just being a father, because I didn't know I was going to have kids. For a long time, I probably didn't even want it. I know I didn't want to have kids. And then to have a set of triplets plus one,
Wow.
has really kind of been an experience. But, probably the best person that could answer this would be my wife, Teresa. But I feel like I've changed over the last, 13 and a half years that I've had the triplets now. Of trying to be more understanding and more empathetic. And I think that's for me anyways, a direct correlation to being a father or mother or parent. Because I don't know if I would have been that way if I didn't have these kids.
No, absolutely. I think they're a life changer, that's for sure. But in a good way. And I think that's one of the positive things that you take away from this, is that no matter what happens or no matter how your path is adjusted, whether you plan for something or don't plan for something, there's always a positive byproduct. But what I did want to say is that the research on like women becoming more empathetic also does apply to men if they are at home. So I think the whole paternity leave thing is so important. And I was actually discussing it with an ex-colleague of mine earlier today, and asking if that has changed in the company. And he said, yes, the paternity leave has gone up slightly. And I think it's so important because other than the benefits between the baby and the parent, it gives mom time off too, but it also gives dad that time to bond with a child that traditionally a couple of decades ago or not too long ago, men would never have done. And men would also be able to develop that empathic side and be able to experience a different side of the characteristics that they hold. So men are traditionally more, agentic in their ways, and women more empathic. And I think that it's then that shift again of that men experiencing something different from what they're used to. And not all men, I'm generalizing here, but it's a wonderful thing to take on those traits and just experience something different and maybe come back with a whole new perspective. Like I think for myself, the other day I was speaking to someone and they were asking me to describe myself. And this is like one of the best ways to kind of see how you rank the different identities that you hold. So for example, even if you go to a job interview and they ask, okay, so tell me about yourself. Like, what's the first thing that you say? Is it like your greatest achievement? Is it your job title? Is it your academic achievements? And what is it? Because I know it might change in terms of the context. Like if you're with a group of mothers, maybe like the first thing you'll attach to is your mother identity. Or if you're with a group of like academics, maybe the first thing you'll put in there is your academic achievement. But it's just to see the hierarchy, the ranking, how that changes. And that is also a really easy way to judge your identity is like, okay, if I'm in a job interview or someone asks me to describe myself, how do I do that? And to come back to your point about empathy, sorry, my long stories.
No, this is good. This is good.
But I was actually thinking about this other day because somebody I had met and we were kind of just there's this program I'm attending and kind of all the attendees are kind of meeting virtually at the moment. So we're all trying to like introduce ourselves and it's quite funny because you just see the way different people introduce themselves. And I kind of thought in my head, traditionally, I would introduce myself with either my academic or my work information first, and then kind of go into like the more personal things. And I think, like I said earlier, I've done so much work on myself in the last like 2 years that I feel like one of my greatest traits is this piece on empathy that I've worked on. And empathy, not necessarily just in the traditional sense of it, but being able to be in a conversation and understand someone else's viewpoint. So let's say you and I are disagreeing on something, or whatever it may be. So we're disagreeing on something and I can then stop and not say anything and put myself in your shoes and convince myself why I should believe your point of view. And I think that's really important and also really important to sometimes also just be quiet and let things kind of move in your head and not just listen to yourself, really listen to other people, their viewpoints. And I think that's almost something I would like to try and change about the way I answer the question. If someone asks me to introduce myself, to rather introduce something like that first, like say, like traditionally I would introduce myself with my work or my academic background, but like this is something I really feel like proud of that I've accomplished within myself in the past while is to be this way, because I think fostering better communication just helps with everything and just better human relations, like understanding somebody else's frustrations, understanding why they feel like that is even more important. So being able to just that empathy is really important. And I think that's something that children generally give parents or teach parents from a very young age, and just to think about somebody else, first. And that translates then into everything else that you do.
That's an interesting topic too, because and I didn't write this question down, but when we think about, I think especially here in the States, and I've read about this before, I've heard others on podcasts, and I don't know if this is I think this is more maybe an American thing where we identify so much with our work. When you first meet somebody, and one of the first questions is, well, what do you do? And it's always in that work, career, business context. And obviously, our identities are made up of so many different, we're so many different people. We're husbands and wives and partners and spouses, and our work and our parenting, and our social relationships, things that we're involved in from a social standpoint, and like trying to wrap all that into like a one sentence line, like defining like, oh, this is me, this is my identity, is extremely hard. And I think the default here, like I said, in the States, just comes back to your career. And while your career is important, I think it largely defines who most people think they are. And I think we can go off the rails with that.
Yeah, no, I really love that. It's so funny because I once read this kind of I don't know if I could call it an anecdote, but it kind of put exactly what you said into perspective, where someone said they had gone to France. I don't know. I don't think it's true. I think it's more just of a way of illustrating this, where if you ask people in France what they do, they'll kind of respond a little bit perplexed, but then they'll say like, uh, I do walking or I do yoga. They never, assimilate themselves to their careers in the sense of like, what do you do? And I don't know if that's necessarily like a language barrier, maybe, or, a perception barrier between like the French understanding and the English understanding. But nevertheless, it's a great way to illustrate exactly what you've said, in the sense that, certain communities, if you ask them what they do, the first thing might be, more in collectivistic societies, might be something socially related. But I think, like you said, in America or other kind of more individualistic countries, it will come down to, definitely to your work identity. And I think it's just the easiest, to be honest, because people understand it. And a lot of the time, it's also a bit of a social ranking. So if you introduce yourself in the conversation saying that, or not so much a social ranking, there's a better word for it, which will come up, but, more around, I'm Christina, I'm a wealth manager. There's already something to attach an identity. All these things go off in your head about what a wealth manager is, what they do, the kind of social ranking they come from, all sorts of things. So it's not just the word, you're assimilating it to the whole stereotype. And, especially, I think, in certain communities, I mean, if I had to think about, a much poorer community, maybe for them also, if they had a job at like a corporate, that might be a great way to kind of, kind of inflate their identity a little bit. Whereas I'm trying to think about somebody who maybe was, had more of a lower end job. Maybe they wouldn't start with their job first, and maybe it would be an achievement first, or an affiliation to like the church or something. But I think it's really interesting to see, the first thing that people identify themselves to, and just to look at it in the broader context too. I think is really important.
So I'm
Context is
curious, how did you become so interested in this field of behavioral science and learning about identities? Like how did you get into this field? I think I'm always fascinated by people's background, especially behavioral scientists, and how they got into what they do.
So I think for me, it goes way back when I was younger. I always had this curious mind. I loved people. I loved, understanding why people are different, why people react differently. Like, I grew up with, two older sisters, and they're a lot older than me. So there's a very big generational gap. And I think it just always struck me that things were different to us. Like, we were girls, like at that age, I could identify we're all girls. There's not a lot different. We all live in the same house. We have the same mom and dad, but yet our perspective on things is just completely different. And the way choices we make are completely different. So I think I was just always very curious about human behavior. And I got to university, actually started studying finance, hated it in my first year. And I thought, I can't be in the books. I need to be with people. And then I started with industrial and organizational psychology up until master's. And it's in my master's year that we had a course on identity. And I absolutely fell in love with it. And I fell in love with the aspect of, sometimes, like, I hate being put in a box. So I'm somebody who will break every kind of norm of society just to prove a point. Like, I'm that annoying person. But again, it's like, I feel like your identity is you. It's what makes you unique. And I think, as much as you live in a society and in a context that is definitely going to sway you, you can't be completely free of societal expectations and norms. But I think your identity allows you to express yourself within that context. And I fell in love with that. And I fell in love with the fact that you could change. I think, couple of years ago, a lot of the times you were kind of not seen as change was seen as very hard. Let me put it that way. And I think as research has evolved, I mean, with neuroplasticity and all these wonderful things, we realize that change is not out of reach. And that's a lot more positive. And I think that that's the great thing about identity is that it's fluid and it changes. And a lot of kind of tensions and happenings in your life change that. And I love that. I love seeing progression, whether it's up or down, left or right, like whatever it may be. It's amazing to see the journey an individual goes on and how that journey changes. What completely goes and what journey do you go on and then come back and realize that, no, I was actually good the way I was, or, you realize that you really need to change and you do change. And I mean, then you have kids and, you learn all these things about yourself. And I think you learn a lot about yourself through your children as well, from what I've heard. I don't have children myself, but my sisters have children and I observe a lot. And I think that they really teach you who you are, because now you have to think about the values you're instilling in your child and making sure that you're giving them the good skills to the best of your ability. And you question yourself a lot too. So yeah, I think
sometimes it's like looking in the mirror, and then other times it's like the mirror staring back. I'm like, I don't even know who you are.
and that's amazing. And I think that's the best part about identity. Sometimes you're lost. And that's also a good place to be, because sometimes things happen in your life that just throw you off completely, and it's okay to be lost. And then the magic happens again as you start finding yourself. And that again means you going into yourself and you doing the work and researching and understanding that I'm not the person I was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, maybe I loved partying and going, and now I don't. And that's okay, because sometimes you feel like, what's happening to me? I don't like doing that anymore. I don't like that group of friends anymore, or whatever it may be, or I don't like running anymore or yoga. And that's okay, because you do change. Your experiences change you. Your thoughts change you. Your reflection changes you. Life changes you, the things that happen to you. So I think that's just the amazing thing about identity, is that it's so fluid. I think the main parts of you will stay the same. And when I say the main parts of you, I think it's those really fundamental, like core values will generally stay the same. Unless there's very big events that kind of shift all of that. But other than that, it's this amazing journey that kind of like paints the picture of who you are. And I think, I'm sure by the time you get to like 50 or 60 and you look back at your identity, it's this fascinating journey. And I think that we need to embrace that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point there, because I was just actually on a call last week with Brian Portnoy, who we're both mutual friends with, and the discussion was around when you look back at yourself, and this is some work that Hal Hirschfield has done as well, is if you look back at yourself today, 10, 15, 20 years ago, you can rate yourself on a scale of how much you changed from like 1 to 10. And when you do that, people usually score themselves pretty high, like high meaning like, yeah, I've changed. But then when people but then the question is, okay, how much do you think you'll change in the future? So maybe looking back, you rate yourself as an 8, but then looking forward, you only rate yourself as, well, I'm not going to change at all. Like maybe I rate myself as a 3 or 4. But yet you just told me that you've changed. The person you are today is not the person you were 5, 10, 15 years ago. So why don't you think that you're going to change in the future? And I think that's really fascinating, because it kind of goes to the whole growth versus fixed mindset, which I'd love to read about that as well. And I think that kind of ties back into what you're saying as well.
No, absolutely. I think that's such a great one. And I think as humans, we tend to overestimate a lot of things. And I think looking back, let's look at the looking back part first. I think one would tend to overestimate how much you've changed when you're reflecting back like that. Whereas I think if you had to then go and say, okay, write down all the ways that you've changed, I think your answer may change slightly. It's kind of like that situation of like asking somebody, do you know how a toilet works? And we'd all kind of be like, yeah, we know how it works. And then it's like, okay, tell me how it works. And then you're like, so you push the lever and then the water goes out. And you don't know there's a piston and a this and a
Yeah.
that. Like, you don't know all of those like magical components. And I think that's kind of the same thing here, where when you're looking back, you can almost, your memory is distorted slightly when you're looking back. So, yeah, I think we tend to overestimate, we're overconfident. I think that's the word. And I think looking forward, you're also overconfident about like, I've done all this work and like, I've had such huge change. Surely there can't be that much change going forward. And I'm so old now. Um, you know, uh, I'm quite fixed in my ways and I don't think there's going to be that much change. And I think what then happens with a kind of looking forward thing is you don't take into account a lot of the events that can still happen. I mean, you could still lose a child, you could get Alzheimer's, there's so many things that could happen that could shift your identity so much in a split second. So I think it's just that overconfidence and looking back versus looking forward. You're almost kind of confident in, oh, okay, I've done so much work. I know who I am. It's not going to change too much. But yeah, I think as long as we kind of I think it's still great if people say 3, because at least they still think they're going to change slightly. At least they're not saying 0, which is, again, that kind of fixed mindset, which is not good. But I think it would also be interesting to see the different generations' responses to questions like this. I feel like this is just my gut feeling, but I feel like the older generation might be a little bit more conservative, whereas the younger generation, with all the kind of new kind of awakenings, or I don't know how to term it well, but the different kind of experiences that they have and the things they are faced with very different. Like it was very traditional world way back then, and now
Right.
it's a very progressive world. So there's a lot of different things you're thinking about. So your identity is constantly being worked on in the younger generation. I mean, just go into social media for 5 minutes and you've probably like hit so many identities that have tensions and there's dissonance everywhere. I'm kidding, not that much, but yeah, I think there's just I think there's my gut feel that the different generations would have different answers to that. But yeah, it's an interesting one, and I think having that growth mindset is key, and I think it's something that we want to kind of teach everybody, that where you are right now is not your final destination. As in terms of your identity and in terms of everything in life, nothing is fixed. In terms of your brain too, the research on neuroplasticity is incredible. And I think that just knowing that you have the ability to change, to form new neural networks like throughout your lifetime is just a game changer. So yeah, I think it's important for people to just go with the flow of who your identity, like where your identity is taking you, and notice those points of tensions. And it's just looking inside of yourself, I think, is the biggest takeaway.
So I've got probably a dozen more questions to ask you. So that just means that we'll have to have another conversation. But typically, my closing question I ask all my guests, which is, what is the best thing about being a parent? And I know that you don't have kids yet, but you disclosed to us all that you are an aunt. So let me twist the question a little bit. What is the best thing about being an aunt, Christina?
Oh my God, I love being an aunt. It is literally like, it's one of like my top identities. And my favorite thing is gonna make all the parents angry, because my favorite thing about being an aunt is being able to spoil my nieces or my nephew, take them out, feed them all the chocolate, and be the best aunt, because the aunt allows them to have cakes and chocolates and sweets, and then take them home and give them back to their parents, and then
Yes.
go back to my quiet life. so I will be hated by all the parents. But I think besides that, they bring so much joy. I think the one thing I love is a hug. There's nothing like the oxytocin from the hug of a child. Like, you could be having the worst day ever, and they like run up to you when you walk in and like give you this big hug. And I'm like, okay, all my problems are solved. So,
Yeah, I would agree. That was like one of the best things about when my kids were young is walking in the door and then just screaming and yelling, being so excited. And now I have teenagers that I'm on my way out of that world. But my oldest girl, triplet Madison, gave me a hug yesterday when I needed it. So it's there's still hope for us, I think. So. Well, Christina, I can't thank you enough for this wonderful conversation. And like I said, I know that there's going to be more in our future, but thank you very much for spending some time with us on the Emotional Balance Sheet podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation, and I kind of forgot my fears as I went along. So thank you.
As you could probably tell from that conversation, I love talking to behavioral scientists on this show, partly because I think I still fight this stereotype every day about what people think a financial advisor is, at least from my perspective. It's this focus on the financial numbers, but really when it comes down to it, I help people manage behavior, and more importantly, I help people manage change, life transitions, whether that's expected or unexpected. So there's a few key takeaways from my conversation with Christina that I want to point out. I think the first is understanding the value of taking time to contemplate your purpose and objectives, even among or amidst the daily responsibilities we all have, especially those parents out there. I've not met one family that's not exponentially busy. We are all busy. Some of us are overscheduled, partly our own fault. But the importance of taking time cannot be underestimated. I would also point out that acknowledging that our identities are not static. They are constantly being shaped by experiences and reflections, which is something that Christina and I talked about. When you look back and you look at how much you've changed, how you rate yourself, but then when you think about your future self, you don't think you're going to change that much, which you're probably underestimating yourself. And last, I would say, and we talked about this with lots of guests, whether it's Daniel Crosby, Brian Portnoy, Christina Graver, Joy Leary, we have to challenge this notion that our careers is what solely defines us. As I kind of mentioned in the intro, we have multiple identities. And we need to realize the importance of those identities and how they interact with each other. Now that you've made it to the end of another great conversation, are you looking for more? If so, head over to tamacapital.com, where you will find all of our conversations. Use the search feature to find the topic or guest you would love to learn more about. Also, don't forget to make someone else's day by sharing our show. So that's all for this week, and we'll see you next time.